Vera, you just wanted to add something to the previous comments that you heard, and then I want to go over to Yuka to talk a little bit about this supplier diversity spat that we are currently.
Yes. And I want to go back to the setting the standards. If you only use the standard as one component, then you will have these problems that you say. I mean, I don't know geopolitically and so on. That's not my area. I'm a technologist. I'm not a political scientist or a policy person. Okay. The problem is, of course, you could try to secure everything, as Kazuo mentioned, and I don't know if you can do that again. That's not my area. What I'm saying is, if you actually if you did the right thing right now, you use the diversity so that you don't have a single player who can see all your data. They can have backdoors. I don't care. They can have backdoors and it can go straight to, my worst enemy. I don't care, because on top of that, I am doing my coding, which we have actually shown recently is post-quantum secure. And as long as they don't have 100% of my data, they cannot figure it out. Okay, you're making the data protect itself. It can even be that they get 90% of my data, right? As long as that 1% of my data, which by the way, could be coming from, I sound like I'm picking on my local coffee shop. It's a lovely coffee shop. I'm sure they're updating their Wi-Fi all the time. But, I'm taking that as, the example of something local that, has zero security. They don't have their own security person, right? As long as I have multiple of those, I'm okay. And so I think it's more a question as to whether strategically we decide, no, I want to make sure that we don't stay in the legacy system of 4G, 5G, all done through 3GPP. Not that they're not doing some great stuff and we should be able to make use of that technology, but that's not our, end-to-end supply in the traditional way. If we make it so that actually you can use multiple networks, you actually don't have that issue. It's just not there.
Yeah. It seems feasible, I think, from a technical perspective, that you can diversify what those points are and then find some ways to secure different aspects of the network.
It's actually it's not out there. It's not weird. It's not like...
Yeah, well, it's weird. It's weird to the policy people.
It might be weird to the policy people, but what I'm saying is it's not, this is not science fiction. Yes. So this is a choice as to, do you really want to protect the incumbents and then you're doing things the old way and then you're going to have an end-to-end secure system? Yeah. Or do you say, sorry, the horse is bolted. Everybody's most of the time on Wi-Fi anyway. And that's a complete different kettle of fish. People don't think of it as 5G, but it's clear that it's already, most of 4G is Wi-Fi, and it's only going to go up with 5G. Or do you say, okay, this is the way it is. Let me actually, if you give me lemons, make lemonade, and make it diverse so that you have trusted transmission over untrusted networks. And the point there is not to have a single path, but to actually have multiple paths. If you don't code, the more paths you have, the more vulnerable you are. If you do code, the more paths you have, the better off you are. So I think this is a choice of whether to protect incumbents or not.
Right. And I want to go to you, Yuka, because you brought up in your opening remarks around some of these supplier diversity concerns. When the United States aggressively put pressure on Chinese telecom companies in terms of their perceived privacy infractions, we had a world race to who would be the reasonable alternative to companies like Huawei, et cetera, particularly since the low cost alternative, not just what Muriel's talking about, but it were a low cost alternative. Some of you don't even realize this. Africa has the highest investment of Huawei equipment, and many countries had to think, well, where do we take it out of the network based on what I think Kazuo and Elsa have talked about in terms of the fragmentation of a variety of systems? How do we actually address, and for those of you that are listening, this is a really important point that I think we're going to bring up in terms of the supplier diversity and this supply chain. You could speak to us a little bit about what do we do if we, in many respects, move China as a key player out of the equation, and where do we find these reasonable alternatives to investing into these network infrastructures?
Right. That's a great question, great points. And I think you made great points about how just simply I mean, also Elsa and Noguchi-san and other panelists have mentioned about, just simply banning Huawei doesn't solve this issue on cybersecurity standards or on future ecosystem of the wireless network. So the alternative, in terms of alternatives, the fundamental problem of this approach was that the US or other countries were not really able to offer alternative, cost-effective solutions to other countries. So some of the trends that's going on, one in the industry led kind of effort is to, this is more led by the telecom operators that were looking for a cheaper solution because market diversity does allow the prices to go down. So one example is the industry consortium called the O-RAN Alliance. Now, I think we've been discussing a lot about this new ecosystem and Open RAN, but to make it very simply, Open RAN is, so traditionally, the RAN network was provided by a vertically integrated company, which has this proprietary hardware and software component of it, and provides this system. But what Open RAN does is to open up these different components of this system and allow different vendors by adopting the standard interface, same interface standards shared by these other vendors to come up with a multi-vendor solution. So one of the industry consortium that has been pushing for this effort is called the O-RAN Alliance, which has been started by a handful of telecom operators, including US and Japan, even China Mobile. So it's really about more of bringing innovation, open innovation, and inclusiveness, I think, is the key here. I guess I'll just add, though, that this push on Huawei ban and this concern on whether you can actually trust this network system provided by companies that has some strong ties with the government through national security laws, for instance, and that requires some Chinese companies to cooperate with Chinese government on intelligence activities, did raise questions. And it's very important this year, especially when the pandemic, and especially when I'm in Europe, I see this discussion changing. In UK, like the conservative politicians have been strongly advocating for review on its China policy and dependency on Chinese equipment in their telecom network. So because of these push and these pandemic, there's this growing interest in diversification. So not just these industry consortiums and small group of telecoms, but now there's, for instance, 200 telecom operators and vendors together in research institutions in this consortium. So it's becoming a global trend to diversify the network system. I think I'll also raise about what Japan's trying to do. So Japan, I really liked how Noguchi-san phrased, Japan sees 5G as a catalyst for innovation. And it's very interesting to see how the government has been the forefront of this push towards promotion of Open RAN. So I think it's widely recognized that Japan was one of the earliest countries, although there's some criticisms or critiques about how fast the rollout is going. It's happening in Japan in the number of base stations, but the governments are providing, for instance, tax incentives to telecom operators that adopted these open requirements or open technology that are interoperable with international vendors. So that's the requirement for these tax breaks or some kind of loans that these telecom vendors can receive. And if you look at some budget items from last year and this year, you can see that the government, multiple agencies have funded some facilities to make sure that these multi-vendor solutions are interoperable. So these are some efforts that some governments has been stepping up. And we also see some growing efforts like bipartisan bills on the plate in US Congress to invest in this R&D and interoperability between multi-O-RAN solutions. And growing discussions in UK right now, they're trying to put together a diversification strategy by the end of this year. So I'll just probably end there, and probably the panelists can jump in.
Well, what you said is so interesting, right? Because I think in the wake of the type of pressure that we're seeing placed on Chinese telecom companies, that you said the buzzword, which is cooperation and collaboration, particularly in technical design. If you all remember, and I've written this also, Japan is no stranger to the world of mobile technology in many respects. Japan was responsible for setting that 3G standard. Kazuo, I want to go to you in terms of this cooperation between the US and Japan. I mean, we're going to see more of that given the fact that there has been this type of response to China when it comes to both what Elsa was talking about in their market dominance and their perception of market dominance, as well as the lack of cooperation, potentially, right, as we're seeing with Chinese telecom companies.